Welcome back to the Podcasting Problem Solver. I'm Leah Bryant, your go-to podcast growth strategist, here to coach you to podcast strategically for better results. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. If I looked at your podcast right now, this very second, would I see consistency? Like episodes going out on schedule, decent audio, thoughtful content? And would I also see that your downloads are maybe, are your leads basically a ghost story? And every quote unquote fix feels like throwing spaghetti at the wall whispering, please stick. Well, if that's you, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You are stuck in the wrong conversation. You're asking questions about execution when the real issue is in the investigation. And today, we are going to reopen that case. Here's what I see all the time. Podcasters come to me saying things like, I think I need better titles. Or they may say, maybe I should post more on social. Or I probably need to be more consistent. And the one that really grinds my gears, should I just start a YouTube? But when I ask why, there's usually a pause because most podcast fixes aren't based on the evidence. You know what they're based on? They're based on guesses. And if I'm being completely honest with you, guessing is a terrible growth strategy. Okay. So what's actually happening? Well, you're following false leads instead of solving the actual case. And you're probably thinking, Leah, why are you using all this detective terminology? Well, tune in next week and you'll be able to understand a little bit more of that. But it's like scrubbing the deck while the ship is taking on water, right? Busy hands and sinking ship. And this is where my seamless podcast framework comes in, because before the attraction can ever work, your strategy has to be sound. Remember, strategy answers questions like, who is the show for specifically? What problem does it solve clearly and repeatedly? How does this podcast support the business instead of just kind of existing beside it? And then what action is the listener supposed to take next? When your strategy is unclear, then the attraction is going to suffer. And when the attraction suffers, people assume the issue is more content, more platforms, more effort. And what you need is better intel and not more output. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, Leah, but how do I actually get that intel? Well, this is exactly what we do in a podcast growth audit. I look at your show, identify what's working, what's creating friction, and map out a clear path forward. You can grab yours in the link below. So let me give you an example of what this looks like in practice. I had a client a couple months ago who had incredibly consistent, solid episodes. And from the outside, this podcast looked fine, but their growth was stalled. They had 0 leads and no momentum. And when I audited their show, here's what I found. The messaging was too broad because she was trying to help everyone. And I get it, because I used to be guilty of wanting to help everyone too. The episode topics were helpful, but they weren't positioning her as a solution. And there was no clear listener journey, as in there was no trust path and no next step, okay? Once we clarified her strategy, tightened up the positioning, aligned the topics with her offers, and cleaned up the conversion path, her podcast finally started working with her business instead of sitting beside it. She then had the same effort, but different outcome, right? Because she stopped guessing. And here's the thing. Her situation is not unique. When I audit shows, I see the same patterns over and over. And I'm going to share those with you, okay? I don't gatekeep, so I'm going to share that with you right now. Are you ready? Pattern 1, the positioning is invisible. So the host, as in you know exactly who you serve and what problem you solve. But a new listener would have no idea from the first episode. You're teaching great content, but you're not establishing authority or clarity around who this is for. All right, pattern number 2. Episodes kind of exist in a silo. So every episode is helpful on its own, but there's no thread connecting them to the bigger picture, right? Like your framework, the offer, your business. So listeners are consuming and moving on because there's nowhere to move to. And pattern number 3, the call to action is an afterthought. If it exists at all, it's rushed at the end, or it's buried in your description. There's no strategic path from listener to lead because the path was never built. Does it sound familiar? Well, if you're nodding along, just know that you're not the only one that's doing this. And that there is good news, because once you see the patterns in your show, then you know exactly what to fix. And then it's pretty straightforward, right? So here's your takeaway. And I want you to sit with this, okay? If you're fixing things without looking at the evidence, you're essentially working the case blind, all right? Before you tweak a title, before you add a platform, before you record another episode, I want you to ask yourself, what's actually happening? Where are the listeners dropping off? And what isn't clear to a new listener in the first 5 minutes? Now, here's how you really find those answers, okay? First, I want you to pull your listener data, which is like in Apple Podcast Connect or in Spotify, right? I want you to look at that consumption rate at the last 10 episodes and see where the drop-off happens. If people are bailing out at the 3-minute mark consistently, that's not a coincidence. No, that is your clue. Maybe your hook isn't landing. Maybe your intro is too long. Either way, that data tells you where to look, okay? Second, I want you to do a stranger test. And I am happy to be that stranger. Send your latest episode to someone who doesn't know your business and ask them, after listening to the first 5 minutes, what do you think this show is about? Who is it for? What should you do next? If they can't answer that clearly, your listeners can't either, okay? Third, I want you to check your own receipts. Go back and listen to your last 3 episodes like you're hearing them for the first time. Are you really telling people what to do next, or are you assuming they'll figure it out? Is your positioning clear in every episode, or does it get lost in the content? These 3 things will give you actual evidence to work with instead of just feeling that there's something off. And this is exactly why strategy comes first in my seamless podcast framework, because you can't scale confusion. You don't attract through assumption, and you definitely don't fix what you haven't examined. And that's what a podcast growth audit is for. Ta-da! It's there to show you clearly what's blocking growth and what you can stop touching altogether, because ease comes from knowing what matters, right? So if your podcast feels stuck, I want you to take a breath. You're just missing the evidence. And once you have that, everything gets simpler. So this episode helped. Make sure you're following the show. And until next time, keep it strategic, keep it sustainable, and stop fixing problems you haven't investigated yet. And I'll see you next time.